The wind howled across the open fields, bending the grass flat and sending dust devils spinning across the dirt road. David stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sky turn an ugly shade of gray. He'd lived in Montana all his life, and he knew what those clouds meant. A storm was coming, and it was going to be a bad one. He took a sip of his coffee and winced. It had gone cold. That seemed to happen a lot these days. He'd pour himself a cup, get lost in thought, and by the time he remembered it was there, it was stone cold. Just another reminder of how the days blended together when you lived alone. The ranch stretched out before him. 5,000 acres of prime grazing land that his grandfather had started with nothing but grit and determination. Now it was worth millions. With cattle dotting the hillsides and state-of-the-art equipment in the barns, David had everything a man could want, at least on paper. A successful business, financial security, respect in the community. What he didn't have was anyone to share it with. 7 years. That's how long it had been since he'd buried his wife. 7 years since that awful night at the hospital when the doctors had done everything they could. But it wasn't enough. She'd been 8 months pregnant, so excited about becoming a mother. They'd painted the nursery together, argued about baby names, laughed about how they had no idea what they were doing, but they'd figure it out together. Except there was no together anymore. She was gone, and the baby boy they'd hoped for had gone with her. David had thrown himself into work after that. What else could he do? The ranch needed running, the cattle needed tending, and staying busy meant he didn't have time to think. His foreman, old Walt, had taken over most of the day-to-day operations, which left David free to work himself to exhaustion fixing fences, hauling feed, and doing jobs that other ranch hands could have done. Anything to avoid coming back to this house, it was too big. That was the problem. They'd built it together, his wife full of plans for the family they'd have. Multiple bedrooms for all the kids they'd planned to raise. A huge kitchen where she'd imagined Sunday dinners with a table full of people. A playroom, a library, spaces designed for a life that never happened. Now it was just him, rattling around like a marble in an empty can. He was about to head inside when he saw something that made him stop. A truck, old and clearly on its last legs, was making its way up his private road. Thick black smoke poured from under the hood, and even from this distance he could hear the engine making sounds no engine should make. David set down his mug and walked to the edge of the porch, frowning. He wasn't expecting anyone. The road only led to his ranch, nothing beyond it. Whoever this was, they were either lost or in trouble. The truck made it about halfway up his driveway before it gave up completely. The engine made one final, terrible grinding noise and then died. The smoke got thicker for a moment, then started to clear. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door creaked open. A woman stepped out, and even from a distance, David could see the defeat in her posture. She looked at the smoking truck, then up at his house, and he saw her shoulders straighten like she was steeling herself for something unpleasant. She walked around to the passenger side and opened the back door. A little girl climbed out, couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. She had a worn backpack and was holding onto a stuffed animal that had seen better days. The woman took the child's hand and started walking toward the house. David met them halfway across the yard. Up close he could see that the woman was probably in her early 30s, with tired eyes and clothes that were clean, but had been mended more than once. The little girl stayed partially hidden behind her mother, peeking out at him with big, wary eyes. "I'm so sorry to bother you," the woman said, and her voice was steady even though David could see her hands shaking slightly. "Our truck just died and I saw your house. I was hoping maybe I could use your phone to call a tow truck. We won't take up much of your time." David glanced back at the sky. The clouds were moving fast now, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the last hour. "You picked a bad day for a breakdown. There's a storm coming and it's going to hit hard." The woman's face went pale, but she kept her composure. "Then if I could just make a quick call, we'll figure something out." "Figure what out?" David asked, not unkindly. "Even if you get a tow truck, which you won't because they won't come out this far in a storm, the nearest town is 15 miles away. The nearest motel is even farther, and those roads are going to be undrivable in about an hour." He could see her processing this, see the fear starting to break through her carefully maintained calm. The little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something David couldn't hear. "Look," he said, making a decision. "I've got plenty of room. You and your daughter can stay here until the storm passes. It's not safe to be out on the roads, and it's definitely not safe to sit in a broken-down truck. The woman's back went rigid. We couldn't possibly impose like that. You don't even know us. No, I don't. But I know that little girl shouldn't be out in what's coming. David looked down at the child, who was shivering despite her jacket. At least come inside and warm up while you think about it. The woman looked like... The blizzard lasted 3 days. 3 long days where the wind screamed like something alive, and the snow piled up so high that David couldn't even see his barns from the house windows. He'd been through plenty of Montana winters, but this one was particularly brutal. On the first morning, he woke up early out of habit and went downstairs to make coffee. He stopped short when he walked into the kitchen. Helen was already there, fully dressed, scrubbing down his stovetop. She looked up and seemed startled, almost guilty. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I couldn't sleep, and I didn't want to just sit around doing nothing." "I hope you don't mind." David looked around the kitchen. It was cleaner than it had been in months. The counters were wiped down. The dishes from last night were done and put away, and she'd even swept the floor. "You didn't have to do that, I know. But you're giving us shelter, feeding us. The least I can do is help out a little." She turned back to the stove, scrubbing harder than necessary. "I don't take charity well. It's not charity. It's just basic human decency." David poured himself coffee and noticed she'd already made a full pot. "Where's your daughter?" "Still sleeping. She didn't sleep well last night. Strange place, strange sounds." Helen finally stopped scrubbing and turned to face him. "Look, I need to be honest with you about something. That truck out there? It cost me everything I had left. And now it's dead, and I don't know how much it's going to cost to fix, but I'm pretty sure I can't afford it." David leaned against the counter, cradling his coffee mug. "What were you doing out here in the first place? This road doesn't go anywhere except my ranch." Helen sighed and sat down at the kitchen table. "I was trying to take a shortcut. I saw it on the map, thought it would save us a couple hours of driving. Stupid, I know. My sister lives in Oregon and we were trying to get there." She twisted her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit. "My husband died a year and a half ago. Construction accident. One minute he was fine, the next minute he was gone." "I'm sorry," David said, and he meant it. He knew that kind of loss, the way it could just reach out and snatch everything good right out of your hands. He was a good man, but he wasn't great with money. Turned out he had debts I didn't know about. Credit cards, a second mortgage he never told me about. When he died, it all came due at once. Helen's voice was steady, but David could see the pain in her eyes. "We lost the house. Lost almost everything. My sister said she'd help us get back on our feet if we could just get there. But now..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Little Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes and dragging her stuffed bunny on the floor. "Mama, I'm hungry." Helen immediately switched into mom mode, standing up and smoothing her daughter's hair. "Of course, sweetie. Let's see what we can make for breakfast." "I've got pancake mix in the pantry," David said, "and bacon in the fridge. Help yourself to whatever you need." He left them to it and went out to check on the animals. The barns were warm and the cattle were fine, used to this kind of weather. Walt was already there, making sure everything was secure. "Storm's supposed to last another couple days at least," Walt said, leaning on his pitchfork. "Roads are completely snowed in. Nobody's going anywhere." David thought about Helen and Sophie in his house. "We've got guests staying until it clears up. A woman and her kid. Their truck broke down." Walt raised an eyebrow. "Guests in your house? That's a first. Don't start. I'm not starting anything. Just surprised, that's all. You haven't had anyone in that house since..." He trailed off, knowing better than to finish that sentence. "It's temporary," David said firmly, "just until the storm passes and we can get their truck fixed." But as the days went on, temporary started to feel different than he'd expected. Sophie was fascinated by the ranch. On the second day, when the wind had died down enough to venture outside for a bit, she bundled up in a too-big coat Helen had found in the mudroom and followed David around like a shadow. She wanted to know about everything. Why did the cows make that sound? How old were they? Did they have names? Could she pet one? David found himself answering questions he hadn't thought about in years. Simple things that he took for granted, but that seemed magical to a 6-year-old girl who'd probably never been on a ranch before. "We had a dog once," Sophie told him as they stood in the barn, watching the horses. "His name was Biscuit. But when we had to move, we couldn't take him with us." Mama cried, but she said it was better for him to go live on a farm where he'd have space to run. I'm sorry you had to give up your dog, David said. Sophie shrugged, but he could see it still hurt. Mama says sometimes we have to do hard things. That's just part of life. That night, David came in from the cold to find the house transformed. Helen had been busy. The living room was clean, really clean, with the furniture arranged better and the windows actually letting in light. She'd found candles somewhere and lit them, making the room feel warm and inviting. And something smelled absolutely incredible. I hope you don't mind, Helen said from the kitchen doorway. I found a roast in your freezer and some vegetables. I thought I'd make dinner, mind? David couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked an actual meal in this house. He usually just heated up something quick or grabbed leftovers. They sat down at the dining room table, the big one he never used, and ate together. Sophie chattered away about her day, telling her mother all about the horses and the cows and how Mr. David had let her collect eggs from the chicken coop. Helen listened with a smile, asking questions and laughing at her daughter's enthusiasm. David found himself watching them, this little family of two, and feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. The house felt alive again. There was laughter, conversation, the sounds of people actually living instead of just existing. After dinner, Helen insisted on cleaning up while David helped Sophie with a puzzle she'd found in one of the closets. It was one his wife had bought years ago, planning for the children they'd have someday. He'd forgotten it was even there. You're pretty good at puzzles, Sophie said, fitting a piece into place. Used to do them a lot when I was a kid, David said. Do you have any kids? The question hit him like a punch to the gut, but Sophie's face was innocent, just curious. No, he said quietly. I don't. Oh, you'd be a good dad, I think. You're nice and you know a lot about animals. David didn't know what to say to that, so he just helped her find the next puzzle piece. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, David and Helen sat in the living room. She was looking at one of the photo albums she'd found on the bookshelf, and he knew before she said anything what she'd seen. She was beautiful, Helen said softly. Looking at a picture of David's wife, yeah, she was. How long has it been? 7 years. David stared into the fireplace, watching the flames dance. We were expecting a baby, a boy. She went into labor early, and there were complications. They tried everything, but... He stopped, surprised at himself for talking about it. He never talked about it. I'm so sorry, Helen said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who understood that kind of loss. They sat in silence for a while, just two people who'd both had their lives torn apart and were trying to figure out how to keep going. Can I ask you something? Helen said finally. Why do you live here alone? This house is huge. Don't you get lonely? David had asked himself that question 1,000 times. At first, I couldn't leave. Too many memories. Then after a while, I realized I couldn't leave for a different reason. This house was supposed to be full of family, full of life. Leaving felt like admitting that was never going to happen. And now I just don't know anything different. Helen closed the album and set it aside. I understand that. After my husband died, people kept telling me I needed to move on, start fresh somewhere new. But how do you move on from someone you loved? How do you just start over like none of it mattered? You don't, David said. You just learn to carry it with you. The next morning, the storm finally started to break. The wind calmed down, and though the snow was still falling, it was lighter. David went outside to start digging out the driveway and found Helen already out there with a shovel, clearing the walkway to the barn. You really don't have to do that, he called over to her. I know, but I'm not good at sitting still. They worked together in comfortable silence, the rhythm of shoveling almost meditative. Sophie played in the snow nearby, making a snowman with sticks for arms and rocks for eyes. When they finally came inside, cold and wet, David made hot chocolate while Helen got Sophie dried off and into warm clothes. They sat around the kitchen table, hands wrapped around steaming mugs, and David realized something. He didn't want them to leave. It was a dangerous thought, one he tried to push away as soon as it formed. They were strangers who'd shown up out of necessity. They had their own lives, their own plans. Helen was trying to get to her sister in Oregon. This was just a temporary stop, a pause in their journey. But the house felt different with them in it. It felt like a home instead of a museum. Sophie's laughter echoed in the halls. Helen hummed while she cooked. There were lights on in rooms that had been dark for years. The roads should be clear enough in a day or two, Walt said when David went out to check on things that afternoon. I can tow that truck into town, have Bobby at the garage take a look at it. Yeah, David said. That'd be good. Walt gave him a long look. You getting attached, boss? Don't be ridiculous. Uh-huh. Because I've seen the way you look at that little girl. And I've seen how you've been smiling more in the past 3 days than you have in the past 3 years. David didn't have an answer for that. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, David found himself sitting with Helen again. They'd fallen into this routine, these quiet conversations after her daughter went to sleep. I've been thinking, David said, the words coming out before he could stop them, about when the storm clears and you get your truck fixed. Helen tensed slightly. What about it? How much money do you have? To get to Oregon, I mean. Her face went carefully neutral. Enough, we'll manage. Helen, I'm not trying to pry. I'm trying to help. I don't need charity, David. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a job. The idea had been forming in his mind all day, and now that he said it out loud, it felt right. My housekeeper retired a couple months ago. This place has been falling apart without her. I need someone to cook, clean, help manage the house. The pay is good, and there's plenty of room for you and Sophie. Helen stared at him. You can't be serious, why not? You need work, I need help. It makes sense. David, we just met 3 days ago. You don't know anything about me. I know you're a hard worker. I know you're a good mother. I know you don't give up even when things are tough. He leaned forward. Look, I'm not asking you to stay forever. Just think about it. Stay for a while, save up some money, figure out your next move. Better than showing up at your sister's place broke and desperate. Helen's hands were shaking slightly as she set down her mug. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. She looked at him for a long moment, and David could see her mind working, weighing options, considering possibilities. Finally, she nodded. I'll think about it. But in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or the beginning of something neither of them was quite ready to name. Outside, the storm was finally ending. But inside David's house, something new was just beginning. 3 months had passed since that storm, and Helen still couldn't quite believe this was her life now. She woke up every morning in a comfortable bed, in a warm house, with her daughter safe and happy down the hall. After everything they'd been through, it felt almost too good to be true. She'd accepted David's job offer, but with conditions. She insisted on paying rent from her wages, even though David had argued against it. She wanted to earn her place here, not feel like she owed him anything. They'd finally compromised on a small amount that made her feel better, even though she suspected David was paying her far more than a normal housekeeper would make. The work itself wasn't hard. The house was big, sure, but it wasn't like David was a messy person. Mostly she cooked meals, did laundry, kept things tidy. The hardest part was trying to bring some life back into a place that had been more like a tomb than a home for so long. She'd started small, opening curtains to let in sunlight, putting fresh flowers on the kitchen table, moving furniture around to make the space feel less like a museum and more like a place where people actually lived. David never said much about the changes, but she'd catch him sometimes standing in a doorway, looking at a room like he was seeing it for the first time in years. Sophie had adapted to ranch life like she'd been born to it. She'd enrolled in the local school, riding the bus down the long driveway every morning. At first, Helen had worried about her daughter being the new kid, but Sophie had made friends quickly. She came home every day full of stories about her classmates and what she'd learned, and she absolutely adored David. That was the part that worried Helen the most. Sophie followed him around whenever he was home, asking endless questions about the ranch, the animals, everything. David never seemed to mind. He'd take her out to the barns after school, teach her how to brush the horses, let her help collect eggs from the chicken coop. Helen would watch them together and feel her heart squeeze in her chest. Sophie had already lost one father. What would happen if they had to leave? What would it do to her daughter to lose David too? But they weren't leaving anytime soon, Helen reminded herself. She was saving money with every paycheck, slowly building up a cushion so they'd have options when the time came. And in the meantime, this was good for both of them. Stable, safe. She was in the kitchen making dinner when David came in, stomping snow off his boots. It was March now, but winter was holding on stubbornly. Smells good, he said, hanging up his coat. What are we having? Pot roast with vegetables. And I made fresh bread this afternoon. Helen checked the oven, then turned to look at him. Hey, I wanted to ask you something. Sophie's birthday is next week. She'll be 7. I was thinking maybe I could make a cake. Invite a couple of her friends from school over for a small party. Nothing fancy, just some cake and games in the living room. Would that be okay? David was quiet for a moment, and Helen felt a flicker of worry. Maybe she'd overstepped. This was his house after all, even if it was starting to feel like home. I think that's a great idea, David said finally. But let me help. We could set up some games in the barn maybe. Make it more of an event. You don't have to do that. I know, but I want to. He paused, looking uncomfortable. Sophie's a good kid. She deserves a real birthday party. The party ended up being bigger than Helen had planned. David went into town and came back with decorations, party favors, and a present that he refused to let her see until the day of. When Sophie's birthday finally arrived, Helen woke up to find David already up, hanging streamers in the barn. "You're going overboard," she told him. But she was smiling. It's her birthday. Kids only turn 7 once. 6 of Sophie's classmates showed up that afternoon, and the house filled with the sound of children laughing and running around. David had set up games in the barn, including a treasure hunt that had the kids searching for hidden prizes in the hay bales. Helen watched from the doorway as he supervised, making sure everyone found something, helping the smaller kids when they got stuck. He was good with children. It was obvious in the way they gravitated toward him, the way he knew just how to talk to them without being condescending. Helen thought about what he'd told her, about the baby he'd lost, and her heart ached for him. When it was time for presents, Sophie opened gifts from her friends with appropriate enthusiasm. But when David handed her a large wrapped box, her eyes went wide. "For me?" she asked, like she couldn't quite believe it. "Open it and see." Sophie tore into the wrapping paper and then went completely still. Inside was a beautiful dollhouse, 3 stories tall, with detailed furniture and tiny little people. It was the same one Helen had seen her pressing her nose against the store window to look at when they'd gone into town for supplies last month. "Mr. David," Sophie whispered, running her fingers over the tiny shingles on the roof. "This is too much." Helen felt tears prick her eyes. Her 7-year-old daughter was worried about someone spending too much money on her. That was what their life had taught her. "Nothing's too much for your birthday," David said gently. "Do you like it?" Sophie launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "I love it. Thank you, thank you, thank you." David looked surprised for a moment. Then his arms came up and he hugged her back. When he looked up and met Helen's eyes over Sophie's head, the expression on his face made Helen's breath catch. That night, after the party was over and Sophie was in bed exhausted and happy, Helen found David in the kitchen cleaning up the last of the mess. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. "The party, the present. It was too much. She's a good kid who's been through a lot. She deserved to feel special on her birthday." "David." Helen waited until he looked at her. "Sophie called you almost daddy today when she was showing the dollhouse to her friends." David's face went carefully blank. "I heard that. I'm sorry. I'll talk to her. Explain that's not appropriate." "That's not what I'm saying." Helen took a breath. "I'm saying that she's getting attached. Really attached. And I need to know what we're doing here." "What do you mean?" "I mean, is this just a job? Are we just your housekeeper and her kid? Because if that's all this is, I need to start setting some boundaries. I need to protect Sophie from getting hurt." David set down the dish towel he'd been holding. "What do you want it to be?" The question hung in the air between them. Helen knew she should say something safe, something that kept the lines clear, but she was tired of pretending she didn't feel what she felt. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just know that this is starting to feel like more than a job. And that scares me." "Why does it scare you?" "Because I can't afford to make another mistake. Because my daughter has already lost one father, and if she loses you too, it'll break her heart. Because I'm starting to care about you. And I don't know if that's okay or if I'm just confusing gratitude with something else." David moved closer, and Helen's heart started beating faster. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm scared too. I haven't let anyone get close in 7 years. This house was my fortress, my way of keeping the world out. And then you and Sophie showed up in that broken-down truck and suddenly everything's different." "Different how?" "Different like I actually want to come home at the end of the day. Different like I hear Sophie laughing and it doesn't hurt anymore to think about the child I lost. Different like I see you in the kitchen making dinner and I can't imagine this house without you in it." Helen's breath caught. "David." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "I know it's complicated. I know we're both carrying around broken pieces, but I think maybe we could be less broken together." And then he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like they were both afraid of moving too fast. But then Helen leaned into it, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and the kiss deepened. It had been so long since anyone had held her, since anyone had made her feel like she was something precious. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. "I can't be your employee and do this," Helen said. "It's not right." "Then quit. Be my partner instead. Help me run this place not because I'm paying you, but because you want to." "David, that's crazy. We barely know each other. I know you take your coffee with too much sugar. I know you hum when you're cooking. I know you check on Sophie 3 times every night to make sure she's still breathing. I know you're strong and stubborn and you don't take help easily. But you're also kind and patient, and you make this house feel like a home again." He took her hands in his. "What else do I need to know?" Helen wanted to say yes. Every part of her wanted to just let go and fall into this. Into him. Into the possibility of a life she'd stopped believing could exist. But fear held her back. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think about this, about what's best for Sophie. I can't just jump into something because it feels good in the moment." David nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Okay, take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." But over the next few weeks, things became harder, not easier. They'd created an awkward distance between them, trying to maintain professional boundaries while living under the same roof. David started taking his meals in his office instead of the kitchen. Helen stopped the small touches, the casual conversations. They were like two people trying to unring a bell, pretending that kiss had never happened. Sophie noticed. Of course she noticed. Kids always did. "Why is Mr. David sad?" she asked one night while Helen was tucking her in. "He's not sad, sweetie. He's just busy with ranch work. He used to eat dinner with us. Now he doesn't. Did I do something wrong?" "No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong." "Then why does everything feel different?" Helen didn't have an answer for that. Walt pulled David aside one afternoon while they were working in the barn. "You're being an idiot, you know that? Stay out of it, Walt." "Can't stay out of it when I have to watch you moping around like a kicked dog. You've got a good woman in that house who clearly cares about you, and you're hiding in the barn like a coward. It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. You're scared. She's scared. You're both so busy protecting yourselves from getting hurt that you're missing out on something real." Walt shook his head. "I knew your wife, David. She was a good woman and she loved you. But she wouldn't want you spending the rest of your life alone in that big house, scared to let anyone in." David knew Walt was right. He'd been using his grief as armor for so long that he'd forgotten how to take it off. And now, when he finally had a chance at happiness again, he was too afraid to reach for it. That night, David knocked on Helen's bedroom door. She opened it, looking surprised to see him there. "Can we talk?" he asked. They went downstairs to the living room and sat on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between them feeling like miles. "I've been thinking," David started, "about what you said, about needing to protect Sophie. You're right. She's getting attached, and if this doesn't work out, it'll hurt her." Helen's face fell, and he realized she thought he was ending things before they'd even really started. "But here's the thing," he continued. "Life doesn't come with guarantees. My wife and I had plans, a whole future mapped out, and none of it mattered. Sometimes things end badly no matter how careful you are. So maybe the question isn't whether Sophie might get hurt. Maybe it's whether the happiness we could have is worth the risk." "And what do you think?" Helen asked softly. "I think I'm tired of being scared. I think I'm tired of living in this house like it's a monument to the past instead of a place for the future. And I think you and Sophie walked into my life for a reason." He moved closer, taking her hand. "I'm not saying we rush into anything. I'm just saying let's try. Really try. See where this goes." Helen looked down at their joined hands. "What if I mess this up? What if I'm not ready? Then we'll figure it out together. But we have to actually be together to do that." A slow smile spread across Helen's face. "Okay, let's try." This time when David kissed her, there was no hesitation, no fear. Just two people who'd been lost finding their way back to something like hope. Outside, the Montana winter was finally giving way to spring. And inside the ranch house, something new was blooming. Everything was going well. Almost too well. Helen kept waiting for something to go wrong, for the other shoe to drop, because in her experience, happiness never lasted long. But week after week passed and things just kept getting better. She and David had fallen into an easy rhythm. They'd have breakfast together in the mornings before Sophie caught the school bus. David would head out to work on the ranch and Helen would take care of the house. In the evenings, they'd cook dinner together, all three of them, with Sophie chattering about her day at school. After Sophie went to bed, David and Helen would sit together on the porch or in the living room just talking. They were taking things slow, being careful. But the feelings were there, growing stronger every day. Helen caught herself smiling at random moments, feeling lighter than she had in years. Sophie was thriving, happier than Helen had seen her since before her father died. And David, well, he laughed now. Real, genuine laughter that made his whole face light up. Then Helen's sister showed up. It was a Saturday morning in late spring. Helen was in the garden she'd started behind the house, planting tomatoes, when she heard a car coming up the driveway. She stood up, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her stomach drop when she recognized the silver sedan. Rachel. Her sister stepped out of the car, looking around at the ranch with an expression Helen couldn't quite read. She was dressed like she always was, perfectly put together in expensive clothes and designer sunglasses. Everything about her screamed success, from her manicured nails to her highlighted hair. "Helen," Rachel said, pulling off her sunglasses. "Well, this is quite the setup you've got here." "Rachel, what are you doing here? I thought you were in Oregon." "I was. Until I got worried because my sister was supposed to show up months ago and never did. I tried calling, but you never answered. So I drove out here to make sure you were still alive." Rachel's eyes swept over the house, the barns, the obvious wealth everywhere. "Looks like you landed on your feet." There was something in her tone that made Helen defensive. "It's not like that. I work here. I'm David's housekeeper." "His housekeeper?" Rachel's eyebrow arched. "Is that what we're calling it?" Before Helen could respond, David came around the corner of the barn with Sophie riding on his shoulders. Her daughter was giggling, holding on to David's head for balance. They were both covered in dirt from helping to repair a fence, and they looked happy. David set Sophie down when he saw they had a visitor. "Hello," he said, polite but cautious. "You must be David," Rachel said, extending a hand. "I'm Rachel, Helen's sister. We need to talk." The conversation that followed was tense. Rachel insisted on speaking to Helen alone, so David took Sophie inside to get cleaned up. The moment they were gone, Rachel turned on her sister. "What are you doing, Helen? You were supposed to come to Oregon. I had a job lined up for you, a small apartment. You were going to get back on your feet." "I am back on my feet. I have a job, a place to live. Sophie is in school and doing well. As his housekeeper, living in his house." Rachel shook her head. "Don't you see how this looks? A wealthy rancher, a widow with a child, all living under one roof. People are going to talk, Helen. They're probably already talking. I don't care what people say." "Well, you should. For Sophie's sake, if not your own." Rachel's voice softened slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm worried about you. You went through hell after Mark died. You lost everything. And now you're here dependent on this man you barely know. What happens if things go south? What happens if he decides he's done with this arrangement?" The words hit closer to home than Helen wanted to admit. Those were the same fears that kept her up some nights. The same doubts that crept in when things felt too good to be true. "It's not like that between us," Helen said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? Helen, I saw the way he looks at you, and I saw the way Sophie was with him. She's calling him Dad in there. Did you know that?" Helen's heart sank. She hadn't known. Sophie must have started doing it when Helen wasn't around. "What's your endgame here?" Rachel pressed. "Are you planning to marry him? Because if you're not, then you're setting Sophie up for another heartbreak. That little girl has already lost one father. What happens when you decide to leave? Or when he decides he wants his space back?" "I don't know," Helen admitted, feeling overwhelmed. "We're just taking things one day at a time." "That's not good enough when you have a child to think about. You need stability. You need a plan. Come to Oregon with me. The offer's still open. I'll help you get settled. Help you find something permanent." Inside the house, David was helping Sophie wash her hands when he overheard part of the conversation through the open window. He couldn't make out all the words, but he heard enough. Helen's sister thought she was making a mistake. Thought David was taking advantage of her. Thought Sophie was getting too attached, and maybe she was right. David looked down at Sophie, who was humming happily as she dried her hands. She'd started calling him Dad last week, and he hadn't corrected her because, truthfully, he loved it. Loved feeling like a father again. Loved being part of a family. But was that fair to her? Was he being selfish, letting her get so attached when nothing was certain? That evening, after Rachel had driven off to get a hotel room in town with promises to return in the morning, the house felt different. Heavy. Helen was quiet during dinner, barely eating. Sophie kept looking between them, sensing something was wrong but not understanding what. After Sophie went to bed, David found Helen sitting on the porch in the dark. "Want to talk about it?" he asked, sitting beside her. "My sister thinks I'm making a mistake, that we're moving too fast, that Sophie's getting too attached." Helen's voice was flat. "She wants us to come to Oregon with her." David felt something cold settle in his chest. "What do you want?" "I don't know anymore. A few hours ago I was sure about this, about us. But then Rachel showed up and said all these things, and now I'm second-guessing everything." Helen turned to look at him. "She's right about one thing. Sophie's getting really attached to you. She's calling you Dad now. Did you know that?" "I heard her a few times. And you didn't tell me? You didn't think that was something I should know?" "I didn't want to make it into a problem when it felt natural to both of us." Helen stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "That's exactly the problem, David. This all feels natural. It feels right. But what happens when it's not anymore? What happens when you wake up one day and realize you didn't sign up for an instant family? What happens to Sophie then?" "That's not going to happen. You don't know that." "Nobody knows that. My husband promised to love me forever, and then he died and left us with nothing but debt. Life doesn't care about promises." David stood up too, frustration building. "So what, you're just going to run? Pack up and leave because you're scared something might go wrong someday?" "I'm trying to protect my daughter." "By teaching her to be afraid? By showing her that when things get good, you should run before they can get bad?" The words hung between them, harsh in the quiet night air. Helen's eyes filled with tears. "That's not fair. None of this is fair, Helen. It wasn't fair that I lost my wife and son. It wasn't fair that you lost your husband. It's not fair that Sophie lost her father. But we can't live our lives running from happiness because we're scared of being hurt again." "I just need time to think," Helen said quietly. "My sister's staying in town for a few days. Maybe it would be good to have some space to really think about what's best for Sophie." David felt like he'd been punched in the gut, but he nodded. "If that's what you need." The next few days were torture. Helen was physically present but emotionally distant. She met with Rachel every day, and David could see the doubts growing in her eyes. Sophie picked up on the tension and became clingy, asking Helen repeatedly if they were going to leave. On the third day, Walt found David in the barn staring at nothing. "You're losing her," Walt said bluntly. "I know." "So what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do? She has to make her own choice. I can't force her to stay." "No, but you can fight for her. You can show her that this is worth the risk." Walt shook his head. "That sister of hers has been filling her head with doubts. Someone needs to remind her why she wanted to stay in the first place." That night, David knocked on Helen's bedroom door. She opened it, looking exhausted. "Can we talk?" he asked. They went to his office, the one room in the house that still felt entirely his. Helen sat on the edge of the leather couch while David leaned against his desk. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started. "About protecting Sophie. About being scared. And you're right to be cautious. You're her mother. It's your job to protect her." Helen looked up, surprised. This wasn't what she'd expected him to say. "But here's what I've figured out," David continued. "I spent 7 years protecting myself from getting hurt again. I locked myself in this house, pushed everyone away, told myself I was fine alone, and I was surviving, but I wasn't living." He moved to sit beside her on the couch. "Then you and Sophie showed up and everything changed. For the first time in 7 years, I wanted to come home. I wanted to sit at the dinner table and hear about someone's day. I wanted to feel like I was part of something bigger than just myself." "David, let me finish. I'm not trying to pressure you into staying. If you think Oregon is better for you and Sophie, then you should go. But I need you to know that this isn't just convenient for me. This isn't just me filling a gap in my life. I love you, Helen. And I love Sophie like she's my own daughter. That's not going to change whether you're here or in Oregon." Helen's breath caught. "You love me?" "Of course I do. How could I not? You walked into my life and turned everything upside down in the best possible way." He took her hand. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm not even asking you to make any promises. I'm just asking you to give us a real chance. Stop being so scared of what could go wrong that you miss out on what could go right. Tears were streaming down Helen's face now. I'm terrified, David. Every time I let myself be happy, something takes it away. I don't know if I can survive losing someone else, and I definitely can't watch Sophie go through that again. I can't promise you that nothing bad will ever happen. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that I will show up every single day. I will choose you and Sophie every single day. And if something does happen, we'll face it together instead of alone. Helen closed her eyes and David could see the war happening inside her. Fear versus hope. Safety versus happiness. The known versus the unknown. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked at him. My sister's been telling me all the reasons this is a bad idea. She says I'm being naive, that I'm setting myself up for disaster, that people in town are already gossiping about us. What do you think? I think she's probably right about some of it. This is risky. It's scary. People probably are talking. Helen squeezed his hand. But I also think that you make me happier than I've been in years. That Sophie lights up when you walk in the room. That this house finally feels like a home. So what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe the risk is worth it. Maybe being scared is okay as long as we're scared together. She managed a watery smile. I love you too, David. And that terrifies me. David pulled her into his arms and Helen let herself lean into him, let herself feel the safety of being held by someone who cared. They sat like that for a long time, just holding each other. I should probably tell my sister I'm not going to Oregon, Helen said eventually. How do you think she'll take it? Honestly, not well. She thinks she knows what's best for me. Always has. Helen pulled back to look at him. But this is my life. Mine and Sophie's, and we choose to stay here. We choose you. The next morning, Rachel came by to pick Helen up for breakfast. But instead of getting in the car, Helen stood on the porch with David beside her and Sophie holding his hand. I'm not coming to Oregon, Helen said. We're staying here. Rachel's face went through several expressions before settling on frustration. Helen, you're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Helen's voice was steady. I appreciate you wanting to help. I really do. But this is where we belong. This is our home now. You barely know this man. I know him well enough. And more importantly, I trust him. I trust myself. And I'm choosing to take a chance on happiness instead of running from it. Rachel looked at David, then at Sophie, then back at Helen. If this goes wrong, then I'll deal with it. But I have to at least try. After a long moment, Rachel's expression softened slightly. You always were the stubborn one, she sighed. Fine. But if he breaks your heart, I reserve the right to say I told you so. Deal. After Rachel drove away, Sophie tugged on David's hand. Does this mean we get to stay forever? David looked at Helen and she nodded. He knelt down to Sophie's level. If you want to stay forever, then yes. This is your home for as long as you want it to be. Sophie threw her arms around his neck. I love you, Dad. And just like that, David's heart, which had been frozen for 7 long years, melted completely. 6 months had passed since Rachel's visit, and life had settled into something beautiful. Helen woke up each morning next to David, still amazed that this was her reality. They'd moved her things into his bedroom 3 months ago, and it felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. Sophie was doing wonderfully in school, bringing home artwork that they displayed on the refrigerator like it was gallery-worthy. She'd stopped having nightmares about losing people, stopped asking if they were going to have to leave. The ranch was home now, truly home, and she knew it. David had changed too. The haunted look that used to live behind his eyes was gone, replaced by something lighter. He smiled easily now, laughed often, and the house that had been a tomb for 7 years was filled with warmth and noise and life. Everything was perfect. Almost too perfect. That's why when David asked Helen to meet him in the barn one evening after dinner, she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. He'd been acting strange all day, distracted and almost anxious. Walt kept grinning at him like he knew some secret, and even Sophie seemed to be in on something. What's going on? Helen asked as she walked into the barn. David had set up lights, making the space glow softly. There were flowers everywhere, wildflowers from the fields around the ranch arranged in simple jars. David was standing in the center of it all, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. He was wearing his good jeans and a button-down shirt, and his hands were shaking slightly. "David, you're scaring me. What is all this?" He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about something Walt said to me a while back. He told me that I spent 7 years just surviving, not living. And he was right. After I lost my wife and son, I just shut down. This ranch, this house, it all became a way to hide from the world." Helen moved closer to him, taking his hand. "I know you've told me this. But what I haven't told you is how completely you changed that. How you and Sophie didn't just bring me back to life, you gave me a reason to want to live again." He squeezed her hand. "I used to walk through this house and see ghosts everywhere. Now I walk through it and see our future." "Our future," Helen repeated softly, her heart starting to race. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Helen's breath caught as he got down on one knee. "Helen Chen, you walked into my life in a broken-down truck during a blizzard, and you've been fixing my broken heart ever since. You're strong, beautiful, kind, and the best mother I've ever seen. Sophie is already my daughter in every way that matters, and I want to make it official. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to grow old with you on this ranch. I want everything." He opened the box, revealing a simple but beautiful diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. A year ago, she'd been alone, broke and desperate, trying to get to Oregon in a truck that was barely running. Now she was here with a man who loved her, in a home that felt like it had been waiting for them all along. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course I'll marry you." David stood up and kissed her, and Helen felt like her heart might burst from happiness. When they finally pulled apart, they heard clapping from the barn door. Sophie was there with Walt, both of them grinning like fools. "Did she say yes?" Sophie called out. "She said yes." David called back, and Sophie came running, launching herself into their arms. They decided to get married in the fall, giving them a few months to plan. Helen wanted something simple, just close friends and family on the ranch. David would have married her the next day if she'd let him, but he understood wanting to do it right. Rachel called when she heard the news. Helen had been nervous about telling her sister, worried about judgment or more lectures about moving too fast. But Rachel surprised her. "I'm happy for you," Rachel said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I was wrong. I can hear it in your voice how happy you are, and that's all I ever wanted for you." "Really? You're not going to tell me I'm making a mistake?" "Oh, I still think you're crazy for falling in love with a man you met because your truck broke down. But it's your kind of crazy,